Okay, can everybody hear me? I usually stand and walk around when I speak. It's a habit I developed when I started teaching. We've spoken a lot today about procedural justice, and it's interesting. I was in some of the earlier sessions and heard people speaking about it. It was very exciting for me. I've been doing this work on procedural justice for about 15 years now, I guess I'd say. And one of the things that's been really gratifying is to have, oh, there he is, people like Julius asked me to come to a session like this, an international session in California, to speak about this issue and my work. It's really taken on some traction in the last few years. And what I'd like to do is talk about what it means for those of you who aren't aware. It's interesting, actually, to start talking about it here in California, because California had one of the first major initiatives on bringing procedural justice to the courts. And I come at the issue primarily from the perspective of thinking about procedural justice in policing, but you can also think about it from the context of almost any legal authority, state authority. So it's not just relevant to courts and to police, but also to teachers and to those who are working in social security offices or almost any kind of provision of government services. This is relevant. So what is it? Well, what are we talking about when we say procedural justice? Well, here's where I like to start. I want you to think about why people obey the law. So you're thinking about it now, and then I'm going to ask you, well, why is it that you think people obey the law? Do people obey the law because they fear the consequences of failing to do so? Do they obey the law because they think it's the right thing to do? Or do they obey the law because they think government has the right to dictate to them proper behavior? Those are three very different conceptions of compliance. The last one, obeying the law because you think government has the right to dictate to you proper behavior, is the way social scientists, social psychologists in particular, the kind of work that I do, define the concept of legitimacy. I'm not talking about a moral philosophical vision of legitimacy, that you can think about it that way too. But if you're a social psychologist and you're talking about legitimacy, what you are talking about is people voluntarily deferring to government requests, orders, court orders, if you're a police officer, a police officer's order, that when a person decides to do that on his or her own because they think that that person that they're dealing with, the person in legal authority over them, has the right to tell them what to do, right? Now, our research shows, and by our, I'm talking about my colleague Tom Tyler, with whom I write frequently, there's decades of research here showing that legitimacy is a very, very powerful predictor of compliance. It's more powerful than deterrence. And deterrence is people complying with the law because they fear the consequences of failing to do so. Now, before any sort of law enforcement folks in the audience get up in arms, I'm not saying that deterrence is irrelevant. That's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that legitimacy is a much more powerful predictor of compliance than deterrence. Deterrence has a role. We can talk about that in a second. It's also true that compliance, because you think it's the right thing to do, you might call that some version of morality, is also really powerful. In fact, it's more powerful than legitimacy. Here's the issue, though. Sometimes we want people to do things that they don't think is the right thing to do, or that they don't want to do. And in that world, we have to come up with a way to try to encourage people to comply with the law. That's where legitimacy plays an important role. So, what's the relationship between that and procedural justice? Well, the research shows that procedural justice is the most important predictor of legitimacy. Now, procedural justice is this term that the researchers have come up with to describe the factors that people key in on to decide that government dictates, decisions, laws, the whole sort of aggregation of pretty much probably all the things that you all do is fair or rightful, okay? And there are four key factors that people seem to care about over and over again in the research. These 4 factors are, and then I'm going to say what they are first, and then I'm going to explain them. The 4 factors are voice, decision neutrality, or decision fairness, treatment with dignity and respect, and trust. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time sort of motivating what each one of these are. Voice is something like participation, an opportunity to tell your side of the story. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'll make it personal for myself. I have 3 children. My children range in age from 8 to 15, but at one time they weren't that old. They were younger, and they were always in my minivan, throwing things around as I drove them around the streets of Chicago. And one time I actually drove through a stop sign while I was leaning down to pick up a bag of goldfish and toss it to the back for my 3-year-old who was going, I'm hungry, whatever he was complaining about. Anyway, so I sit up, I roll through the stop sign, and there's a cop behind me, and he pulls me over, and he says, do you realize that you ran through that stop sign? And I immediately said, I apologized first, and I said, well, I have to explain to you what I was doing. I was trying to pick up the goldfish off the floor and toss it to the, right? Does he care? No. Of course he doesn't care. But he sat and he listened to me. And that was really important to me. And it was important to me, I didn't know at the time, this was before I started doing this research, but it was important for me to tell my side of the story. I think socially and psychologically, it's important to signal to the folks that you are in relationship with that you are not regularly an offender. So that's one example of voice. Another example of voice and participation is having the opportunity to participate in community meetings, having a say in the criminal policy that's going to take place in your neighborhood, participating in the particulars of an ordinance or law that might affect you. So we've seen it in research from that level of high generality to the micro interaction that I had with my police officer. Second, decision-making neutrality. What is that? People are looking for indications when they are dealing with those in legal authority over them, that the decisions that those folks are making are fair. What would that look like? Well, one place you can start is to simply explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. Again, let's use a cop. If I'm pulled over and stopped, I want to know why I'm stopped. And if the person doesn't tell me, I'm less likely to think that it's fair. I'll give you another example. I've been involved for the last decade or so in Chicago with these violence reduction strategies. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. One of the things that we do is we bring in people who have a violent crime or a gun crime in their history. We bring them into a forum in groups of 20, and we explain to them the consequences if they have a gun or pick up a gun in the future. We have another component where someone who used to be involved in offending explains how he or she, usually he, turned his life around. And then we explain the availability of services. And we explain in the first section that there's going to be a new set of consequences should that person pick up a gun. It's really important that we do that beforehand. Why? Because when the person is picked up later, there's no opportunity for the person to say, you singled me out because I'm from the Tenderloin, or I'm from Brownsville, or because I'm black, or because I'm young and Latino, right? We've explained beforehand the terms of what's going to happen, and that person is aware. That's decision-making neutrality and fairness. Third, treatment with dignity and respect. This one is huge. This one is probably the most important factor we found in the research when it comes to individual level measurements of procedural justice. I emphasize individual level because if you're not actually talking about particular interactions, the factor loadings change, and maybe we can get to that at some point. I'm trying to keep this to 20 minutes, and I've been speaking for 8 right now. So I think the best way to think about treatment with dignity and respect is this. If you ask a lawyer, of which I am one, what racial profiling is, that person will say, well, It's when a police officer makes a decision to engage with a person on the basis of race, right? And if you know anything about the law, you know that the Fourth Amendment says that a good decision for a police officer's engagement with someone is one in which the police officer has enough information to believe that that person is about to or has committed a crime. So if it's a stop, then it's reasonable suspicion. If it's an arrest, it's probable cause. But in any case, the rightfulness of the decision legally turns on the amount of information that that officer has to engage the person. Now, if you ask a person who's been racially profiled why they feel they were racially profiled, they will almost invariably say, the officer was rude to me. The officer didn't treat me with respect. The officer didn't treat me in the way that I think he or she would have treated me if my skin were a different color or if I came from a different country. And what's interesting about that dichotomy is that the cop can say, well, I had a reason. I had a legally legitimate reason for interacting with that person. My reason is fully sanctioned by the Fourth Amendment, and that may be true. And yet, the person will still be convinced that he or she is racially profiled. So in fact, the infamous, I was gonna say famous, but probably infamous, incident in Cambridge, Massachusetts involving Professor Henry Louis Gates and Sergeant Crowley, I'm sorry, I can't remember his first name right now, was like that. Sergeant Crowley's actions were legal, and yet Professor Gates was convinced that he was racially profiled. I actually was on a commission that analyzed that arrest, so I had an opportunity to speak to both of them at length multiple times, and so I know both sides of their story. And what's interesting, of course, is that the law does not accommodate what I'm talking about right now. It doesn't talk about treatment with dignity and respect. The Fourth Amendment doesn't care. And one of the things that's very interesting about what people care about, though, is that it really matters to them. And last, people really care about believing that a person in legal authority over them will treat them benevolently in the future. This one's a squishy one. This one's hard. It has to do with moral value alignment, primarily. Those are the kinds of questions that we ask in surveys to get at this. One way of thinking about this term, this particular factor, is that it's sort of historical, right? So in any particular interaction with someone, there might be decision-making fairness, there might be treatment with dignity and respect, there might be an opportunity for the citizen to have voice. But she might not have that expectation of treatment with benevolence because of her own past interactions with not necessarily police, other folks in state authority, teachers, the person in the line at the Social Security office, and also what she knows from her friends, right? Because this is a social network story. Now, the good news on this last factor is my colleagues Tom Tyler and Jeff Fagan have shown, and this research, there's not a lot of it, but the pieces that are there are pretty strong. This can be changed over time, right? So there are some people who believe once you've had a really negative interaction with the courts or with police or with other people in state authority, that's it. There's nothing you can do to change that trajectory. And the procedural justice research that my colleagues have done, the longitudinal work, has shown, in fact, that you can. Right? So it's like a bank account, right? It gives you an incentive to make investments in that account over time so that you can get a payoff later, and it also means, right, that you're making that investment for your colleagues too, in case, unfortunately, one of them may screw up. I have just a few more minutes before we give you guys a chance to think about how this plays out in your own lives. But let me show you how powerful this is by thinking and showing you some examples from my research. So I was just talking about the violence reduction strategy we've done in Chicago was built around these concepts. The general strategy is based on some work in Boston back in the 90s, which you may have heard of, called Ceasefire. Some of you may know David Kennedy's work. Our strategy was based on that in terms of bringing people in. What was different about it is that we brought in particular individuals, the ones I told you had this particular background. They had either a crime of violence in their history or a gun crime in their history. So we do it at the individual level. And also, it was designed very deliberately around these ideas of legitimacy. So in addition to having the three-part message of, here are the consequences if you pick up a gun, here's the person who's going to show you how to change your life around, here are the opportunities for services, we designed the architecture of the room in a very particular way. So right now, we're doing the architecture in a way that I think is really bad. What's bad about it? You're in an audience, I'm standing in front of you on a podium. This means I'm important, and you are not, right? And you don't really want to do that in these kinds of meetings, right? What you want to do is you want to reduce hierarchy. You want to signal egalitarianism at every possible moment. So the way we do this is that we set up the meeting in, we call it urban league style. We set up a table in a square, and we have the participants who are people who are recently released from prison, and all of the speakers also sit at the same table, and there's no hierarchy, there's no podium. We also do this to ensure that there is physical accountability. That's why I walk around when I talk, so that nobody is in the back can go to sleep, you know, and I can come back here and I can talk to you and you can see me and I can see that you're looking at me and I know that you are listening. But it's also important that all of you can see one another. That's another reason why we set up the meeting that way. Why is that important? Because an important aspect of this message isn't just that each one of you hear the message individually. That's what we would call first order information. A critical aspect of creating procedural justice norms is that each one of you knows that every one of you is also hearing it at the same time. And you can create that architecturally, right? By putting everybody in a circle. The other thing that we do is that we never have these meetings in any kind of a law enforcement location. We have them in places of what I call civic importance. What are those? Well, we're doing a replication of this in New York with James Broderick, among others. And in Brooklyn, we do it in a Brownsville Community Center. In the Bronx, we do it in a really nice museum. In Harlem, we do it in the Adam Clayton Powell building. These are all places where ordinary citizens are welcome to come, and we want to signal to the people who are coming to this meeting that they are ordinary citizens too, right? All this to say that the substance of what you convey to people is as important, or let me flip it. The nonverbal signals of the architecture and the like are just as important as the substance. What you want to do, I say, is avoid shark music. What does that mean? Well, imagine if there was a picture of a beautiful beach scene on this screen right now. Close your eyes and imagine it. I'm sure that's making you all very happy right now. You're thinking, I'd much rather be there rather than in this windowless basement listening to this woman speak to me. Okay, but while you're feeling happy about that, now imagine that you can hear the theme from Jaws playing. I bet you're not happy anymore, right? It's scary. And if I then say, well, now let's think about Paco Bell. Hopefully we all know Paco Bell. Or if not Paco Bell, imagine your own happy. Happy. How about happy? Let's channel Pharrell right now. Happy, right? Right? So there's a big difference between happy and the theme from Jaws. And you want to turn off the shark music when you're conveying this information to people. Okay, so I've come to the end of my 20 minutes, but I just want to review quickly how powerful this can be. We tested our strategy in two different ways. We looked at its effect on aggregate crime numbers and its effect on individual desistance, individual level desistance from going back to prison. How do I want to say that? It's not recidivism. It's survival. How long you stay out on the street. How many months you stay out on the street. Okay? On aggregate crime numbers, we could show through some fancy statistical kung fu that as you increased the percentage of people who were eligible to attend the forums who did, you were having a very serious impact on the homicide rate in Chicago. In fact, we were having something like a 33 to 37% reduction homicide rate that we could measure. And then at the individual level, and these were the results that I was really excited about, we could show that the people who participated in this forum for 1 hour, 1 hour, that's it, and only once, and they were randomly assigned, were 33% more likely to be out of prison after 60 months compared to people who didn't. And I think I'll just stop right there.